Hey guys, welcome back to the One Room Schoolhouse here at WallBuilders. Today we're going to get into the stories of Abigail Adams and Benjamin Franklin. And because we are dealing with people from a long time ago, we thought the most appropriate person to bring in and help us understand this better
was somebody who knew him.
Yeah, that's right. So firsthand experience, we're going to hear firsthand. So what was Franklin like as a child?
Did you go to school with him?
Well, really, it was a lot of
kites?
fun to see him when he was swimming because he put those paddles on his hands and his feet. And,
as an inventor?
Yeah, that's as an inventor.
Okay.
He was innovative. He was a kid. He was innovative.
So we're still going through kind of covering biographies. One of the things that we have available at the WallBuilders website are different biographies of kind of heroes from American history. And so we're telling some of their stories along the way. We do have lots of cool things from Abigail Adams, from Franklin, things he was involved in. But let's start with Abigail Adams. Certainly, Abigail and John Adams, one of the most recognizable and noted couples. Their relationship really interesting. Starting off, Abigail and John was kind of an interesting scenario because Abigail took John back to meet Dad, and her father's a pastor, and Dad wasn't real sure about this relationship.
Yeah.
No, tossing. Anybody want to pick up?
You want to pick up?
No, you got it.
No, he wasn't real sure about it. As a matter of fact, he wanted a preacher for his son. And so Abigail's sister had a preacher boyfriend, courtship. And so Dad's really pleased with that, but Reverend William Smith was his name, was Abigail's father's name. He wasn't real certain about having an attorney in the family. That was not a good deal.
Well, and so there's a biography, Wives of the Signers, that goes through several of the women who, as you can imagine, were the wives of the signers of the Declaration. And so it does have some of Abigail Adams' story, and so in it does have the account from Abigail's own testimony that she brought John home, and her father was like, this guy's never going to amount to anything. He's not really the kind of guy we're looking for. Obviously, he did amount to something. He was pretty special in some regards. But their relationship, even looking back at the letters, they wrote back and forth. It's something that, for a lot of the Founding Fathers, you don't get a good look into the relationship that husband and wife had.
Yeah.
For John and Abigail, you get a pretty good first-hand account of their relationship.
It is really. I first read a book of the two of them in 1841. It was a book of the familiar letters of John Adams to his wife.
Wait a
Abigail.
second.
You read it in
1841?
Well, look, I knew Franklin in 1760.
I mean,
what's his name, man? Come on.
I feel like Indiana Jones has found like this cup of the carpenter, and you took a couple drinks and you survived.
Exactly. Is that a surprise?
Okay.
So reading
it was published in 1841.
It was published in 1841, and so in reading that a number of years ago, it was so interesting going back and forth between them because it's like you feel like you're eavesdropping on a really private conversation, but there were so many hilarious things in it as well. I mean, one of the ones that stuck with me, first time I saw John Adams and Abigail as real people rather than just heroes, was after they put the if you want to say the Boston Tea Party. And so we're not importing tea anymore. And so John is writing Abigail. He says, I so miss my tea. I so miss not having tea. And I went to a tavern, which was their restaurant, where you also have a lodging place. He said, I was there, and he said, I asked the proprietor, asked the lady if she had tea, and she said, why, Mr. Adams, you know we don't have tea. He said, so I tried coffee for the first time, and his line was, and I've borne up under it quite well. Like, trying coffee, well, it was really hard. I thought, here's a real guy
it's
with
actually
real
the official
emotions.
drink of America right now.
Well, it is,
we threw all the tea
not for
away,
this guy.
so.
I'm still the tea guy.
We actually have an original letter from Abigail Adams as well. We have a lot of writings, documents, artifacts from obviously early America, but this is one handwritten from Abigail. It's a little hard to see because we do have it in a little protective cover as we allow people to kind of see it and hold it when they come in. But their letters back and forth, their relationship, they were very affectionate to each other. Sometimes at terms, I'm almost a little embarrassed reading it like, okay, I feel like I'm watching a Hallmark movie sometimes, right? Like, this is just silly. But as John is part of the American Revolution, because we know John Adams signed the Declaration, he becomes the first vice president, the second president, but during the American Revolution, he was over in Europe helping try to negotiate peace into the war, trying to help get allies, and did a lot overseas. And so Abigail is at home really running everything while he is gone.
Yeah, and it was unusual back then because for a woman to be a business owner, which she was, she took over their business, ran it. For a woman to be literate in that sense, because women didn't have formal education yet, although Abigail
At least it wasn't
advocated for
as common, right? Because
they could
some
be
women
taught
did,
by tutors,
but it wasn't as common,
That's right.
certainly, as it was going to be in the future.
But she teaches herself French. She teaches herself foreign languages. She teaches herself business. She was super good in so many areas, and she was a self-motivated woman.
And in the
Really,
midst
really
of it,
good.
right, even what she did as a mother is very interesting because we have some, in the letters of Abigail Adams, there's a really neat letter when one of their sons, John Quincy Adams, goes, right, and John Quincy Adams becomes the 6th president of the United
Kind of
States.
becomes important.
His resume is actually one of the most impressive of anybody in
that's
early
right.
America.
That's right.
What he did and what he accomplished, absolutely remarkable. But he goes with his dad, 1778, over to Europe as Dad is working on negotiating and doing things.
Let me set up something here real quick on that, because as you got to understand how she raised him. If you go to the church they attended in Quincy, Mass, outside First Congregational Church, there they call it First Church, there is actually a bronze statue of Abigail and John Quincy Adams.
Oh, that's
And
cool.
She's got him by the hand, and they're going into church together.
And yeah, so with that being said, we were there recently and it was under construction, and so they actually had that covered so you couldn't see it. So presumably it's still there.
It's still there.
But they created this image that they wanted people to recognize Abigail Adams was very faithful in attending church and very faithful in taking her kids to church. And so this statue of her leading John Quincy Adams was rather significant. So as she is then writing to her son, who's with Dad overseas, I guess he was technically the secretary to his father, the diplomat, and she writes him and says, hey, hope you're doing well. Here's what the family's doing. I miss you so much. We love you. While you're over there, make sure you remember everything we taught you. And she says at one point in this letter, it would be better that you drowned in the ocean than you grow up this immoral, graceless child. Essentially, if you deny your faith, it'd be better off that you die in the ocean, which is a crazy thought. But she's giving him such an interesting perspective of how important faith is in your life, that it would be better for you to die early than live a long life rejecting faith and these moral principles that you have learned. So she really is. This is a book. When I first read this book, I was so impressed that I took this book back to my wife because we were reading all the biographies to make sure they were good. I took this back to my wife. I said, you have got to read this. This is one of the greatest, and it's really small. Short little biography, but really fun picture of Abigail Adams. So that's one. Benjamin Franklin is another pretty interesting guy.
It's a lot thicker, but not because he's more valuable. It's just he has so many things he got involved with.
Well, yeah, and obviously different author, right? Different editor, and so there's different process involved. But Franklin, we know he signed the Declaration, signed the Constitution. There was a lot he was involved with. Obviously, we know he signed those documents. So there was a lot he was involved with. And as an inventor, his whole life is interesting because he's one of the founding fathers that today is categorized as the example of how the founding fathers really weren't religious.
Yeah, I mean, he said he was a deist in his autobiography, so obviously he was a deist, right?
Well, and so that is what his autobiography says, except I would ask, well, what does he say like a paragraph later? Because people point out, well, Franklin said he was a deist. Well, he did say he was a deist. He said he was a deist apparently like when he was in his 20s, except the following, it couldn't be later in that paragraph. It's like just a couple lines below.
It's like on the same page, next page, depending on how you cut it. He goes on, and then I rejected that because I found it worthless.
Yeah.
It's like literally about that strong language.
Yeah, he said, because even if this were true, I found that it was of no benefit to anybody. Which is super interesting because Franklin was a guy, when he became the governor of Pennsylvania, he promoted the Bible, but promoted people, encouraged people to go to church, wanted the Bible and Christianity to become more important. And this is where, when he talked about deism does no good for people, even though, right, we could debate, we don't think he was a Christian, he still recognized the value of the Bible, the value of Christianity, because of the morals it produced in people, and good morals allow for a free society, and we want to have freedom in the society, therefore we should do this.
And he thought that the morals expressed in the Old and New Testament were the highest standard of morals
let's
ever.
back up, because you were talking about when he's governor, you're talking about morals. Go to 1776, when he authors the Constitution, the very first Constitution from Pennsylvania. It says, you can't hold office in this state unless you believe in the divine authority of the Old and New Testaments and believe in a future state of reward.
Which is so interesting if he doesn't believe in anything.
Right.
Yeah,
well,
if he doesn't.
Yeah,
right.
And right, what we know from his own writings, we know he believed in God. We know he believed in miracles. We know he believed in the Bible.
Yeah, the power of prayer,
right.
the future state of rewards.
He wrote his own little mini psalms on God answering his prayers. I mean, he talked about how God answered his prayers.
Where people have a question is toward the end of Franklin's life. There is a letter. Essentially, there was 3 months left to live. The president of Yale University, Ezra Stiles, who was a pastor, I believe. Right?
He was a pastor as well. That's
so
right.
Ezra Stiles, a pastor, is writing to Franklin and says, "We want to put up a picture to honor you." And Yale had given Franklin an honorary degree. Well, do you remember what the degree was? I don't remember at this point.
They gave him they gave him a literary degree back in 1753. I mean, years before.
So he had a connection to Yale, was kind of the point, because Franklin was one of the uneducated founding fathers. He was like an elementary school dropout. He was actually, would call that homeschooled after that. So he was homeschooled.
He was self-homeschooled.
Yeah.
That is homeschooled.
Yeah, so people that are being critical of homeschoolers, right? There was an article that came out from
Harvard,
not just
Harvard and Yale.
Yeah, embarrassing, right? On a lot of levels,
really bad.
For how much they missed it on some areas, but.
Hey, go ahead. The article from Harvard said you should not be homeschooling. This is a terrible thing for the nation.
Yeah, it's authoritarian, and you're probably like a right-wing religious extremist.
Yeah.
Like, that's the language of it. And if
How
you're
bad
homeschooled,
homeschooling was.
you know,
Yeah,
it was terrible.
It implies that the homeschool kids, they're disadvantaged. They're not going to be socialized. They're not going to be properly educated.
They're going to hate democracy.
It's more likely that they're going to suffer abuse, and it's never going to get caught. Because if you send kids to school, then teachers can report parents, but if they're at home, nobody can report the parents, and so we know homeschoolers abuse their... I mean, the article's stupid, right? Nonetheless, Franklin was homeschooled. And Franklin did pretty well as a homeschooler, got an honorary degree from Yale. So Ezra Stiles writes him a letter 3 months left of his life and says, "We want to put up a picture at Yale to honor you. Do you have a portrait? Would you be willing to send us a portrait?" And in this letter, he also says, now, as a religious person, I'm just curious... Where do you stand on the position of Jesus being the Son of God, Savior of the world? He says, as a Christian, right, this is what I believe. I'm just curious what you believe. I don't mean to offend you. Please don't take this the wrong way. I've just never talked with you about this. I want to know what you think. So Franklin writes him back, says...
And I love his response, especially about the painting, because he goes back and he says, "I've never liked any of the paintings that anybody's ever done of me. I always look old and fat and ugly." And, maybe it's because I am all those things.
Yeah,
but I don't
maybe
like
reality check, because I am old and overweight.
And how old was he at this point? He was like in his upper 80s, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so he was old. But super characteristic in his wit. But then he goes into his religious beliefs, right? And in it, he talks about how, nobody's ever really asked me my opinion on Jesus Christ and whether or not he is the Savior.
Imagine he is nearly 90 years old, and nobody's ever asked
Yeah,
him.
he was best friends with George
Yeah, he was
Whitefield.
friends with Whitefield, the most famous evangelist in the First Great Awakening. How are you... It's like being friends with Billy Graham, right? Whatever the most prominent pastor is today. How are you friends with the most prominent pastor and they never asked you? And really, when you understand kind of the context of history, Calvinism was very, very heavy, and so there's the elect, and so this kind of Arminian free will and free choice isn't really what's being promoted or taught, and so it's just, well, God either is going to save you or he's not, and so this whole thought of the nature of the divinity of Jesus was not as pertinent as we would say it is today, right? When churches at the end of almost every service, right, they're going to give the gospel message and some kind of altar call, some kind of salvation spiel at the end. That's not the way it used to be in early America, even from the most famous evangelists.
Yeah, really different.
Yeah.
And so he writes back to Ezra Stiles, the minister, and he's like, nobody's ever really asked me that, which means I've never applied myself in the study of it, so I really don't know one way or the other on it. And he ends it again with some characteristic wit, and at this point, I don't have enough time to really get into it and study it to the full extent. But I have a feeling I'm going to find out pretty soon anyways.
Yeah, if he's divine or not, right? Because I'm going to die and you go there.
3 months later.
And it's interesting that in the PS he says, "But please don't tell anybody this, because I've tried to be friends with every different denomination, with all these Christians, and I wouldn't want them to think less or poorly of me, because I've supported them in their work and their endeavors, and I would like to go out of this world the way I've tried to live in this world, by being friends with all these different groups and people, so please don't say anything." So we know with 3 months left of his life that at this point he didn't consider Jesus divine, which we would say kind of necessary to salvation
a little
because
important.
we believe that comes through Jesus. It's possible in the last 3 months of his life that he questioned and considered, and maybe he came to faith in Jesus. We don't know that, but what we do know is even at the end of his life, he was not anti-Jesus. He just wasn't sure about Jesus. And so this is where kind of the complexities of Franklin, his story is so fascinating with all he did.
It's really one of a kind.
And not only, right, obviously faith is a big thing people talk about, but he had a lot of, we have some of his writings, which are pretty cool.
Oh, yeah.
Well, let me throw in one other thing, because I was just seeing on the web last week in some articles that, in looking at Franklin, we talked about how, earlier about Franklin, he says he's a deist, and that's what people keep repeating. I just saw on the web that Franklin was a slave owner. So how do you have a slave owner founding father? That goes to the narrative that all the founding fathers are slave owners.
Now I was going to save that for the end, but since we jumped in right now, that's okay. So Franklin was one of the founding fathers who did own slaves, and the argument today is that the numbers that people use are that 41 of the 56 of the founding fathers owned slaves, at least the signers of the Declaration owned slaves. That number is up for debate. Because some of the people they include in that, there's not really good evidence that they owned slaves. They grew up on plantations and maybe their family owned slaves, but there's not good evidence that they inherited those slaves or that they had slaves in their life. But one of the most important questions that is missing in the whole equation is not how many founding fathers had slaves, but how many founding fathers that had slaves freed their slaves and then opposed slavery. Because even though obviously it's wrong to have slaves and they were wrong for doing that, if we don't tell the rest of the story and be able to applaud them for now freeing their slaves and opposing slavery, Benjamin Franklin, I don't know any biographer of Franklin who considers him a racist,
That's right.
even though he did have slaves. And the reason they don't consider him a racist is because of what he did with the slaves.
That's right.
Yeah.
And by the way, he had slaves in the 1730s and 40s when he was a newspaper editor. He had 2 to 4 slaves working for him on the newspaper, helping him with publishing, helping him with sell ads, etc. So he had them at that point in time, but that's a long way off from what you've got right here.
And so I try to toss to you, right? So what did he do with the slaves was the important part.
Well, what we've got here, and he freed them. And then afterwards, what we have here, this is the Constitution of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, and it was actually started back in 1744. This
1774.
1774. This is from 1778 after, it gets restarted. But what's super interesting...
1787 again.
1787.
You're looking at it upside down.
I'm reading it upside down.
Don't listen to him, just read the page. It's all right there.
But what we have here is the list of officers. And if you look, the president of the Abolition Society is Benjamin Franklin. So, right, as Tim was mentioning, Benjamin Franklin is one of these guys who frees his slaves and then goes all out in advocating for freedom, for emancipation. And what's also interesting, some of the other names, we have Benjamin Rush here, another signer of the Declaration. He came in and also...
Benjamin Rush also was a slave owner.
also was a slave owner, freed his slaves, and then spent the rest of his life advocating for freedom. And really being one of the people like, hey, right, in the words of the Declaration, all men are created equal and deserve those rights of freedom.
Yeah, so certainly they didn't advocate for that. One more document we have from Franklin that's worth noting before we get out. This is probably one of the more popular known writings of Franklin.
This is a Poor Richard's Almanack. And I'll let one of you guys read the years.
That's 1753, which I think is the same year that Yale gave him the degree.
Or it's around that period, yeah.
Yeah, it's right around that period. But these were really known. I mean, an almanac you'd use for planting. It would give you times, whether it's to tell you about eclipses coming up and what the average rainfall is going to be.
Not bad for a homeschool kid to produce something like that.
Right.
Good job, homeschoolers. Keep it up. You're doing great. And this is where, when even we mentioned that there are the Wives of the Signers, there's other biographies called Lives of the Signers, which will have some of Franklin's story as well. And then there's been so many biographies written about these guys. There's so much more to their story than the simple kind of generalized statements that are said today.
Yeah, for sure.
And when you learn their story, what you discover is not only with like the John and Abigail Adams, where you realize, wow, their people, their relationships were actually kind of cool. You kind of see their humor, you see things in it. Reading some of their writings, really, it's kind of, they have cool parts of the story that today are largely forgotten. So we'd encourage you, if you guys want to know more, we have these biographies on the WallBuilders website, and you can just do some basic research. So this week, we're going to continue to go through the next couple days, more biographies, tell more of these stories, show you some more of the artifacts we have. But as we are navigating through this, we are praying. We're already seeing states that are starting to open things up. We are praying that this continues and it opens up, and that jobs, people that are out of work are able to find work again, that God is able to help families navigate through what's going on with the finances, the economics. We're praying for you guys as well in the midst of this. If you have questions or prayer requests, you can leave them in the comments, and we will try to respond to those as we can. But thank you guys for watching, and we'll be back tomorrow with another One Room Schoolhouse.